All right. And welcome back, guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. Welcome. Thank you for being here. If you are new here, please do me a favor, leave me a review, whether you are coming from Spotify or Apple Podcast. I appreciate it. It is helpful in terms of letting me know what you think, letting me know what you want to see more of, letting me know what topics I have beat to death, what topics I have failed to cover. Thank you. Now, if you are coming from YouTube, like, comment, subscribe. Very, very important, very helpful in terms of getting the word out on this, on me, on the services that I offer. Yes, I do offer coaching services. That can be for a competitor. If you yourself are a competitor, someone you love, someone close to you competes, and they are looking for someone to help them do that. I do offer that, as well as coaching for non-competitors. So whether that is fat loss, whether that is building muscle, whether that's just getting, really those are the two big ones. But let's say you're in that intermediary where you don't really know, like, hey, am I too fat? Do I need to cut first? But I also kind of need muscle. I don't know where to go from here. I don't know which step to take first. I can help you figure that out. I do offer monthly coaching as well as one-time consultations. Now, one-time consultations, real quick on this. This is not something that you are locked into. It's not something that you have to do it, like pay for like a year up front or anything like that. This is on a needs basis. So let's say you already have a coach, but they don't do the whole like lab work thing, or they don't do the PED thing. Or I don't know, maybe you're in that spot with your coach where you're like, hey, I'm happy, but I want to make sure I'm getting everything out of the effort that I'm putting into the respective phase. Let's book a call. I've got the links to both of those in the show notes below. So take a look at that on the consultations. That's something that you can continue to book. Hey, if you have a coach and they're on board with it and they're like, hey, I want to join in, we can make it a group call. That happens actually more than you would think. Let's dive in. Today, what are we covering? So expectations with diets, expectations in a fat loss phase. Yep, I'm going to go into both segments for the competitive athlete and the non-competitive athlete or individual, lifestyle, gen pop, whatever label you prefer. A lot of the questions that I get, the questions I get on Patreon, the questions I get in the comments on YouTube, questions I get in the DMs. Yes, there's a lot of questions in the DMs. Typically oriented around, hey, this is what I'm currently doing. I don't know if it's the best, but usually there's a problem. That's why people reach out. Now, people aren't really reaching out to tell me, which is a shame, because I like getting these messages too. If you're someone who's like, things are going great, just letting you know, those are nice. Let me know how you're doing. But most of the questions that I get typically involve, specific to fat loss, they typically involve someone having either a stall or potentially just this like expectation that things should be going differently than they're currently going. Now, really with this comes context that I need, and that's the context that I'd like to provide you today. So expectations, what can you expect when you're dieting? What are the big ones? And I don't mean like, hey, you put yourself in a 500 calorie deficit a day, you can expect to lose 1 pound of fat. I've said that like 1,000 times already. I'll probably keep saying it because I think it's good information. I think it's an important reminder. But when we start getting into the weeds of like, what is normal, what is not normal, big one that I think is important to consider. Number one, weight loss is probably not going to be linear. So what do I mean by this? The weight that you lose per week. Let's say you go in and you're like, hey, I've got the next few months. I would like to chip off 10 pounds of body fat. Okay, well, yes, like we could design this, we could develop a strategy that allows you to inherently aim to lose a specific amount of weight per week. And I'm a big fan of this. I'm a big fan of having something measurable on a weekly basis over 7 days to assess like, hey, in these 7 days, did you lose enough weight to hit that target? Yes. But in reality, specifically for female clients, but also male clients as well, weight loss is not going to be linear. I think it's actually completely normal to see fluctuations, even if you change nothing, even if adherence is 100% perfect, even if you aren't doing untracked meals, cheat meals. You're pulling from this like series of, I guess, the subset of data, 7 days, and assuming that you're taking your weight every single day over 7 days, you're pulling and you're collecting basically an average from that data. You're collecting a high and a low, which is the style, or I guess the approach I like to take with clients, because if you just take a single weigh-in, or let's say 2 weigh-ins a week, there's a very good chance that one of those weigh-ins is going to, let me back up and say this. It's very unlikely that across 7 days, you are just going to see continuity in your scale weight. There's a lot of variables that go into what that number, that final number that's just spit out in the morning whenever you step on the scale. There's a lot of variables that go into that and that modify what that number is. Even if you are completely adherent, even if you're like every variable, like you're measuring your sodium, like you're just doing the eighth of a teaspoon, like still you have different fluctuations physiologically that ultimately are going to skew what that scale weight reads. And I think a lot of people early on, at least this was the case for myself, I would get really caught up in Monday's weight versus Tuesday's weight versus Wednesday's weight. And it's not to say like, keep an eye on it. And if like you're definitely moving like in the wrong direction, yeah, we might need to assess what's going on. Let's say, going up consistently 1-2 pounds even over like a very short time span. Okay, like maybe something else is happening here. Maybe there's a miscalculation that's occurring. But I personally, I think it's very abnormal to see those weigh-ins reflected in a week's time. I think it's very abnormal to see similar scale readings, and it can be discouraging. It can be discouraging when you start a fat loss phase, especially if, let's say that first week, the first 4 days, it's going down, and then Thursday, Friday, you get hit with a high weigh-in. So weight now has gone up 2 pounds. There's typically an explanation for this. And I think for the clients for the individuals who are a little more sensitive psychologically, which this is me. This is me to a T. This has been me most of my time in fitness, in bodybuilding. Whenever I see that scale weight go up, I mean, at one point I'll be like, whew, like I need to change everything that day. Like as soon as I get off the scale, I'm like, what did I do wrong? And then there's some anxiety, and like I'm sharing this. It's been a long time since I felt that kind of reaction to scale weight, but I'm sharing this because this is something that I see oftentimes. Like most clients that I work with, they get kind of bent out of shape when they see scale weight go up, even when they know like, hey, I have been 100% adherent. I've done everything that you asked me to do. I hit my water. I slept well. GI is moving well. It's normal. And when you look at the change week to week, this is obviously, especially if you're using something like the average to determine like, okay, what was the rate of change that week versus the next week versus the next, it's very normal to see that rate of change fluctuate. Now you also have to consider like, okay, we have hormonal fluctuations that if you're normal, like and I say normal, it sounds so harsh, but if you're someone who is like very consistent in terms of your menstrual cycle and you have like 28 to 30 days, but like, I mean, exactly, okay, this is when it's going to come. It shows up. Cool. Even then, you're probably going to have a week where even being on track, you don't see that drop. You don't see that drop in scale weight. Now, it's good. Keep this in mind. Hey, if you started a new training program, if let's say you're seeing increases in performance, so specifically like the weight that you're lifting, like you are training at a higher intensity than you ever have, very normal to see fluctuations. Now, what I want to say is like, I had a client this week who's very advanced. She is very good at like regulating emotions whenever scale weight doesn't drop the way she would hope it would. But even then, she's like, yeah, like if it doesn't drop, we know what we need to do. The point I want to stress is that go in to that fat loss phase knowing that there's going to be some fluctuation. There are going to be some weeks that, just like maybe it's artificially inflated, maybe you get several artificial low weigh-ins. Another client this week, she comes to me, she's like, "Ooh, I was out in Sedona. I was like sweating my ass off. Like there were so many days like I was still hitting my water, but like I just felt like I was dehydrated." And like, yeah, we could see it reflected on her weekly sheet. So within the tracker that I have clients use, see like multiple low weigh-ins back to back to back. So her total rate of change this week, it was much greater than previous weeks. And we know like going into it, okay, well, like she did lose body fat. She's in a fat loss phase. Yes. But how do we take that data? How do we extrapolate that? And how do we set expectations for the following week? This goes both ways, whether there's an artificial high or an artificial low. It's going to skew that average. I mean, like I know this probably seems really like fundamental, but I think it's important, especially if you're coaching yourself, or let's say you're coaching under someone who they're not as communicative with those kind of shifts. Like you don't really know. You're like, hey, I didn't lose as much this week. How long are we going to ride this out before we drop food? Yeah, well, in that case, like you yourself being able to identify like, okay, well, if I'm actually in a deficit, if I'm in the same size of a deficit that has produced said result, the target change that you want to see, let's just say it's a pound. Okay, unless something was heavily modified, like unless like you went from I don't know, like you went from like doing truly like just no structured cardio, and now all of a sudden this week you have the free reign and you're like, okay, now I'm going to do stairs, and all of a sudden your weight's like plummeting down. Okay, but that is due to a change. But assuming everything is constant, assuming no changes have been made, there's typically an explanation behind why weight is not moving or why weight is moving excessively quickly. So I think like whenever you go into that weekly assessment, again, if you're assessing yourself, you're self-coaching, you're like, okay, well, I don't really know what to do because I'm going into week 2, week 3, and I don't know, do I need to drop food? Maybe not. Maybe you don't need to drop food if you're actually in a deficit. But I think the important thing that is a part of like the skill development, I think is really helpful for someone, I guess, learning the skill of losing body fat, is being able to identify what variables cause that artificial inflation. Now, this becomes convoluted the less accurate food reporting is. So depending on where you're at, I mean, and I know it's a big thing right now, like, okay, should I have cheat meals? Should I have untracked meals? Should I have a day off tracking completely? Should I have a day where I just like macro match and I just plug things in, but it's still at the same intake? For me personally, this is a preference. When I'm in a fat loss phase, I would rather not do cheat meals. I would rather not do untracked meals unless absolutely necessary. And this is especially true early on in that diet, because at that point, we're still establishing the deficit. We're still trying to determine, okay, like based on this very loose calculation, here's how much weight I should be losing this week. So week 1, I mean, like, you have a few days that are like loosely tracked. You have a few days that you were like a little bit over, or in the case of someone doing cheat meals, like you have a day that you were at a much higher intake than the other 6 days, assuming it's just one meal or one day. That's going to muddy that data, and ultimately it's going to make the decision making around whether you should drop food or increase cardio, whether you should create a bigger deficit. It's going to make it that much harder. Now, when you begin to get into that rhythm, let's say you've had a couple weeks under your belt and you're like, okay, I can pretty much guarantee that this deficit is the deficit that I think it is because I'm seeing consistent results. Okay, then at that point, you can make the decision, is this fast enough? Now, expectation number 2. It is important to not overbid I guess like I should state the expectation. Hunger is going to be something you experience more than likely. Sure, there are some people that they have, I would say they're not as sensitive in terms of hunger signaling, but generally most people are going to be hungry when they're eating in a deficit. And I think it's something that a lot of people, they will try to avoid. They'll try to, not try, because that like indicates, or I guess implies that they're actively like circumventing it, but truly they'll go in with the expectation that if I'm hungry, I'm eating too little. I mean, it's all relative. It's all relative. It's relative to your hunger signaling. It's relative to how much hunger you can actually tolerate. But I think it's an important expectation to have just out the gate, to know like, hey, I'm eating less than I need to sustain my body weight. Therefore, I'm probably going to be hungry. And there's going to be a certain level of hunger that I have to accept in order for me to get the progress, in order for me to see fat come off, in order for me to see scale weight go down. Now, to what degree should you tolerate hunger? Very individualized. This is something that I really think like it has to be relative to what's the potentiation of weight gain, like weight regain after the fat loss phase. So now this is a different conversation when we're looking at a contest prep client or someone who's getting on stage versus someone who is just trying to get into better shape, just trying to achieve a leaner physique. If you're someone who is going into contest prep with the expectation that like, hey, I know I'm going to be a little hungry, but I don't want to feel that chronically. I'm going to tell you, like contest prep, if you've never done it before, you're going to feel that probably a lot of the time, like majority of the time. And then eventually, for me at least, like the hunger just becomes an everyday thing. It becomes something that like meal to meal, like at a certain point, like you finish a meal and you're like, I want to repeat that same meal immediately upon finishing it. That was not enough. Your methods of dealing with that, of coping with it, I mean, a lot of it's going to be intrinsic. A lot of it's going to be remembering, okay, here's the trade-off. I'm getting this, getting to this destination of stage. Like it's very objective. It ends at a certain point, and I know that I'm not going to try to sustain this body fat level. Therefore, the weight is going to come back on, and I'm not going to feel this hunger indefinitely. Now, I think this can become very slippery and compounding when you're not in contest prep, when you're just losing body fat, yet you're dealing with a high degree of hunger. And the expectation is, okay, well, I want to lose the weight. I want to get it off. I don't want to regain it. If you are not at the physique that you want to walk around at, and you're not necessarily trying to achieve like this crazy low body fat, yeah, there needs to be the consideration. Like you need to establish the point in which, okay, can I sustain this general level of hunger? Because yeah, like food's going to go up in that case. Like you're not going to be at those calories forever, but you're also not going to be, more than likely, eating in a hefty surplus, because the goal after a fat loss phase, a non-contest prep fat loss phase, is to likely not regain the weight, or at least not regain all of it. And if that's the case, like, I think it's really important to be able to assess, be like, okay, what are the things on a daily basis that I'm willing to experience? What are the feelings, like physiologically, mentally? What can I handle? Because the more that you push through that, the more that you are like, no, like I'm just disassociate, I'll just suck it up, I'll just keep going. The more frequently you have to do that, the greater likelihood is that you're probably going to go off track. And it's not to say there aren't tools, there aren't ways that you can manage that hunger, and there's a lot of ways you can go about it. But for each person, myself included, like there's still a point that if you continue down that path, kind of are setting yourself up for failure. You're setting yourself up to eventually be non-adherent, which it's okay to be non-adherent if you accept the consequences. I say that very loosely because I'm I'm not promoting, I'm not pushing you to be in this like hyper restrictive state. I think you should go through phases where you're eating at least at a maintenance. You should probably go through phases. Most people listening to this should go through a period where you're eating in a slight surplus. But the criteria, I guess the condition that like needs to be understood is that even when eating at maintenance or eating a little bit more food than your fat loss than when you're in a deficit, you still need to be able to be on track. Like you still need to have some kind of structure and methodology to how you're approaching your diet. And if you continue to dig yourself into this hole where dietary fatigue is excessive, well, eventually you're going to break. And that's the point I want to avoid people getting to whenever they're losing body fat. I don't want them to get to the point where they just start being impulsive with food decisions. And this is, again, like I want to stress this heavily. This is for individuals who like they're all on board with this. If you're like, hey, I modulate my calories and my body composition intuitively and I like how I look and I'm okay with slight fluctuations up and down, sick, okay, continue doing that to your discretion. But this is more for the person. This is more speaking to the individual who's like, unless I'm following a structured plan, I feel like I'm gaining too much weight. I feel like the way that I eat, I need direction even on a regular basis, even when I'm not trying to lose body fat, because I don't feel like eating intuitively results in the outcome that I'm striving for, i.e. it typically results in me gaining body fat. Okay, being able to at least establish, okay, like this might be a little uncomfortable, but I can still tolerate it along the way throughout your fat loss phase, while accepting that while you're getting to that destination, this is what you're signing up for. You're signing up to be not as full, not as satiated, not eating aimlessly. And I think when we're really looking at like when you should cut that off, it's to the point where adherence begins to go out the window. When you start to have impulses that maybe you act on, maybe you do overindulge, and okay, like it's a one-time occurrence. If you're coaching yourself, you have a conversation with yourself. Yeah, I don't like how I ate yesterday, but that was just a one-time thing. I'm not going to make that a regular occurrence. Okay, sick. If it's something that repeatedly you're going off track, and then you begin to experience that like guilt shame cycle of like, oh, I feel terrible now and I don't want to assess my physique, which is like, this is coming from real experiences that clients share with me. If that's where you're at, then we need to take a step back. We need to assess, okay, how long are we going to continue to push the diet? How many more pounds of body fat are we going to pull off? If we continue to accrue dietary fatigue without implementing some kind of intervention in order to drop off that dietary fatigue, what does that look like after the diet? Does that put you in a position where you can still follow even your maintenance calories or your slight surplus calories? Because typically for like a contest prep, the hardest part post show, and I mean, like I put this up as a Q&A, what's the hardest, put it up early June. And a lot of people they're like, it's staying on track, knowing that I don't have that goal ahead of me, knowing that I'm not moving in the direction of having an improved physique, having something to run towards. And that's what I want to avoid. For the non-prep client, we don't need to dig you into this hole, or I really like the analogy with like accruing debt in a fat loss phase. I fucking wish I would have started with that to begin with, because I think it'd make a lot more sense. Accruing like dietary fatigue, it really is something that like it can't be avoided. But if you accrue so much debt that at the end of the diet, or even like at post diet, at the tail end of the diet, you're like just waiting for your coach to tell you like you can have a meal off track because you've got all these ideas, all these foods that you want to eat, you want to indulge in. It's like we're probably at the point where we need to have those interventions in place. Because if you don't, I mean, ultimately you're just putting yourself in a position where you're probably going to eat in a way that You don't want to. Probably going to slip up. And if that's something that begins to affect your adherence in other regards, okay, maybe you slip up on your diet, so then you're not as keen to get your water in, or you're not motivated to get into the gym because now you feel like maybe in your physique it's like it's reflected that you've not been as disciplined. If that's the case, if you're beginning to experience those, like, I want to say like psychological adaptations, well then we got to assess. We got to assess what we're doing. This week I had a client who she had asked, she was like, hey, I know I'm not hitting the target rate of change that initially we were hoping for. We still have like 4 or 5 weeks left on her fat loss phase. It's a structured fat loss phase. So it's not a mini cut where it's very short. It's only like 4 to 6 weeks. It's like a 10 to 12 week cut. And she's like, I want to push if you think it's necessary, because right now, like my target weight that I want to end the diet at, right now I'm not on track to hit that because I've had a few weeks where instead of hitting 1.2% change each week, I hit like 0.8 or 0.5%. And that's where, like, having that conversation with her, I'm like, we can push, but frankly, like the adaptations that you've reported, the things that you've mentioned, like you're really, really hungry and you're having cravings. And even though we've like modified the diet, we're trying like, high low days now to see if that like staves off some of the hunger. And what I told her is, I'm like, honestly, I think we're at the upper limit of what you can handle in terms of a deficit. If the goal is to not regain the weight very rapidly post-diet. You also have to consider things like, okay, do you have a period coming up where, like, even if you wanted to, you're not going to be able to track as consistently? Do you have a vacation plan? Do you have a work trip planned where, frankly, like, you can try to be adherent, but like, you're going to have meals out that are hard to track. They're not going to be as accurate in terms of food reporting. In those cases, especially, I think it's important to be conservative and to underbid in terms of like the deficit we're creating. Like, yeah, get to your goal, get to where you want to be, but not at the expense of now putting yourself in a position where in this next period of life, you're like, I'm going to be in a different country for, 10 to 14 days. Like, I want you to enjoy it. I want you to be able to indulge a little bit. I don't want you to go off the rails. I don't want you to binge. I don't want you to become obsessive with food, because again, all of those things, like you can add on a lot of weight very quickly. And then what do you know? Okay, you finished a 10 to 12 week fat loss period, a fat loss phase, but now you're in a position where you're ready to do it again. Yet there hasn't been enough time post diet for you to really become re-regulated. Still carrying around some fatigue from that, even though, body fat is higher. It's very similar to like that post-show period, but I think this isn't something a lot of people consider. I don't think it's something that a lot of people think about when making decisions in the diet itself. Do you drop food? Do you increase cardio? Well, how are you doing? Like, is what we're doing, is it relatively sustainable? Expectation 3. Now, the leaner that you get, the lower body fat you get to, like the numerical body fat percentage, not that the actual number matters, but relative to where you started the diet. So you could even, instead of the percentage, you could just look at the number of pounds that you've lost. Someone who's lost 5 pounds versus someone who's lost 20 pounds, that's going to be a very big shift, like homeostatically. The leaner that you get, the more weight that you lose. Yes, it's more likely. There's a greater chance that hunger is going to be higher, and that's going to directly correlate there. But the more important recovery is, and this is where I think in contest prep, a lot of people get it wrong. Yes, they're doing their best to manage fatigue, but like at the end, especially if you're falling behind and you've got that deadline approaching, it's like, well, we're just going to have to buckle down, assuming you still want to do the show. But if you're not managing that fatigue, if you're not leaning into these recovery tools, if you're not getting an adequate amount of sleep, if your training volume isn't appropriate, if you're kind of just like, doing the extra credit workouts. You're doing a little bit more cardio here and there. You're feeling, I get it. You're feeling motivated and you're like, okay, I'm going to switch without telling my coach, or I'm going to make the switch to a form of cardio that is going to drive up a higher degree of fatigue. This becomes exponentially harder. The more weight that you've lost, the lower body fat begins to get to. And I think really looking at like the total amount of like wherever you started the diet, that change. If we're talking about someone who is losing 20 pounds, we don't have the ability to be reckless when it comes to recovery. I mean, you do, like you technically can. I've seen this hundreds of times at this point. I've seen it in myself where whenever recovery starts to dwindle, whenever it starts to slip, those mistakes, like those instances where you do get 4 or 5 hours of sleep, I mean, they hurt. Like you feel it the next day. You see it reflected in your training performance. Weight's not moving as easily, maybe weight's not moving at all, and you're like weight in terms of like load on the bar. That's where I think going into the phase itself, you really have to, from the start, be like, okay, here are the tools that I have to manage this fatigue. Sure, there might be days, maybe you have kids, you're like, okay, well, they didn't sleep, so I didn't sleep. Understandable. Maybe work is of greater stress, you have more demands. So you're like, okay, I'm going to have to work more, even if it's not physical fatigue, like the mental fatigue that accumulates from those stressors in life. If you're not managing those, if you don't have a plan of how to manage those, that diet is going to get harder, and it's going to get harder the more weight that you've lost. And the question I usually get is from individuals who are, maybe they're feeling extreme bouts of exhaustion, fatigue. Should I do a diet break? Should I do a refeed? Should I change up my carb source? Well, like, sure, like all of these things in isolation, I can give you answers to them, but it really all comes back to what tools are we using to manage recovery? Are they being managed? I guess that's the first question. Is there any room for improvement in how we're managing that fatigue? Things like an increase in calories, yeah, that can be helpful. But what I oftentimes see is people will get to the point in their diet where they're needing these things so frequently that in itself is undoing the deficit that they're in. Now, weigh this out. Like, if you still have 5 to 10 pounds that you want to lose, yet you're at the point in your diet where you're like, I need multiple days at maintenance, or I need multiple days in a slight surplus, or and I say that like loosely as if someone's going to do that in a structured way, which would still be preferable as opposed to just doing like an untracked meal, assuming that you're doing an untracked meal in a way that is putting you over in calories. That in itself is going to affect that rate of change, because the purpose of that occurrence, that increase in input in calories, it's to drop off dietary fatigue. But if you're not expecting that, if you expected to go into that week with, say you do the multiple refeeds or you do the multiple untracked meals, it's like, I don't typically expect someone to lose as greatly, lose to the same percentage as they would the previous week. So what did we do by that? Did we extend the diet another week? And for contest prep, okay, like maybe the decision making is much simpler in the sense it's like we don't have the time because that deadline is strict. It's very firm, which like in reality, it's not very firm. Like specifically for bikini, there's a lot of shows that you can do. So it's like, keep that open-ended. That would be my advice. But when you're talking about someone who has already been dieting for an extended duration, they've already been, they're 2-3 months in, they're past the 12-week mark. That typically is the point where I'm like, hey, like, if we're needing these things in excess and it's actually taking away from the fat that we're able to lose, what is our exit strategy? Like, what can we do at this point to, smooth out these speed wobbles that are occurring? And I'm not saying like a refeed or I'm not saying these things are inherently bad. They're not. They can be utilized as tools. But the way I think about it is very much like, just bottom line, like, okay, this is taking away from us being in a deficit. if we need to do these things repeatedly and and it's not allowing us to stay in the deficit, maybe this is an indication that we need to wrap up the deficit. Maybe this is the point where the deficit has become too great. This is also a big reason that I like to incorporate diet breaks, refeed, untracked meals. I like to incorporate them prophylactically. So in advance, almost all of my clients who are going into a fat loss phase, even prep clients, we have a week right around like the 8 to 10 week mark, if we can afford it, where we're like, or I'm like, hey, we're gonna plan to not lose weight this week. We're gonna plan for no weight loss. We're gonna bring food up. We're gonna bring it up maybe to right under maintenance or right at maintenance. But the idea being like, this is going to allow us to manage fatigue before it becomes unmanageable. I think there's value in doing these things ahead of time. I mean, like with any kind of like relationship, just the latency in which you address issues is going to be huge, and it's going to have a direct impact on whatever outcome it is we're trying to achieve. In the case of like dieting, okay, we're trying to not put you in a position where we're trying to wash off fatigue, but we're also trying to lose body fat. Like that's where I like to keep it very specific. This week or this set of days is the goal to be in a deficit, and if it is, can you be in a deficit? And if you can't, then we need to take advantage of that time. I found that to be very effective, like just highly effective for myself in preps, because it has essentially, like we can say at the 4 week mark, okay, we got 4 weeks left or 6 weeks left, whatever it is, we can see that's the point where we're going to take a beat and we're going to assess, like, are things going the way we're hoping they would go? Are we still on track? And if we're not on track, what needs to happen? Why aren't we on track? Expectation 4, how you create the deficit, it will affect how hard it feels. If you create the deficit exclusively through cardio, if you run up cardio to a point that now it's like a task every day, like it is not something that you're able to do and just like, I don't want to say mindlessly do, because I don't think that cardio, for like intentionally doing structured cardio, I don't think it's mindless. I think it's something that like you do got to be present for. And like, sure, like low intensity, steady state, I mean, you can still burn calories without putting forth like a high degree of effort. But if you continue to accrue this thing that has to occur, this output as you go through your fat loss phase, you're going to find like, okay, it does get harder the leaner you get. So if that is the bulk of how the deficit's being created, I don't tend to find that people do well long-term with that. I mean, like, yes, there are individuals who they have the time, they have the resources, they have the recovery tools in place so that they can manage, a higher output, but there still is a ceiling where it becomes unmanageable. And that's where, when we create that deficit, I would be very cognizant that we're not doing it simply in the easiest method, which, like, for me, like I was that person. I was like, I want to eat a little bit more. I want my meals to have like actually more volume, and like I want to consume more calories. So I'm willing to do more cardio if that's the cost. And I think it's important to have the awareness that if you're committing to doing a certain amount of cardio, the longer you are having to do that, the more fatigue is going to accrue. Now, ultimately, we need to sustain a baseline level of performance in the gym relative to weightlifting. Otherwise, you're just going to become catabolic, assuming that you're in a deficit. And we're talking about it in the context of someone who's like trying to get, let's just say, very lean, like in a fat loss phase, contest prep. That baseline performance in the gym, that baseline level of output that you're having in your weight training sessions, if that begins to slip on account of cardio, it's not going to be the same. We're not going to hold that muscle. It's going to, eventually, if you've ever tried to just do cardio without weightlifting, the shape, it's going to be different. And maybe if you need to atrophy some muscle, okay, maybe that's okay. Maybe that's something you're like, it kind of works out. But for most people watching this, that's not the case. They're wanting to, and most people who come to me are wanting to build muscle and lose fat at the same time. And if that's the case, like for sure, performance needs to be our number one priority. Creating that deficit through a balanced means of lowering food to a threshold that, again, is reasonable, that doesn't put you in this like overly rigid scarcity mindset. I mean, like that in itself, that is going to accrue dietary fatigue. So like, I mean, I know some people are like, yo, like it seems like you hate cardio. I'm like, it's not anything against cardio. It's just the fact of how it's oftentimes abused, specifically for the female client. It's oftentimes something that I see like people will lean into so heavily without giving the proper consideration to how hard this is actually making the diet. The same rule of thumb applies to lowering food past the point of what is manageable. Lowering food to a point where, yeah, now performance is impacted because you're simply not eating enough. And this happens too. People will come to me and they'll be like, hey, I don't have time to do cardio. I hate cardio, actually. I would rather just bring my food very, very low. Can we bring it to 1,400 calories? And I'm like, yo, like even with cardio, we might even need to bring it a little bit lower than that just to create the deficit, to put you in a position where you can lose that amount of fat per week. That threshold in which we bring food down, it needs to still support training performance. And that's where looking at our other tools, looking at step count, looking at fat loss agents, these things can be helpful. But ultimately, the thing that I see that's going to allow us to get the most out of this fat loss phase is adhering to the timeline, like adhering to our weekly goal, adhering to a weekly rate of change. And I know I started out saying like, okay, like we're establishing this baseline of like, is this the deficit that we think we're creating? But there's an aspect to this where if you're not in the deficit that you think you're in, being willing to make those adjustments and make them quickly, make them before you've allowed for 3, 4, 5 weeks of stalled progress. It could very well be that your weight is not stalling. You're just not in the deficit that you think you're creating. Expectation number 5, if you take extremes, if you do things to create the deficit that require a lot of willpower, a lot of discipline, this is going to make the habits, the behaviors in the fat loss phase, it's going to make it that much harder to sustain, thereby increasing the likelihood that you're going to regain the weight post-diet. So that's where like doing like 2-a-days for a non-prep client, I'm like, if it works for your schedule, great. But the harder it is for you to stick to whatever it is that we do, even if that means that we lose at a slower rate of change per week, I'm still going to say that that's favorable as opposed to, just putting your head down for a week and doing everything within reach to try to lose as much fat as possible. It's a very standardized approach to drop someone down to 1,200 calories, put them at, 45, 60 minutes of cardio, 5-6 days a week. It'll work. But if that is something that requires like a vast lifestyle change for the individual, if that requires that they complete like their whole schedule looks differently, and then there's a lot of planning and a lot of pivoting just to adhere to that plan, I mean, inadvertently, like you're setting yourself up to not be able to follow that. And that's where like finding that balance of, okay, this is a little bit more work. This is more work than what I've previously, like what I naturally do, but it's not unmanageable. That's key. Finding the amount of work, the amount of discipline, willpower that you have to practice every day while in this phase, finding that and not overextending yourself to a point where now it becomes detrimental. It's kind of like the same thing with elimination diets. Like I will have people that come to me, they're like, hey, I'm going to not have any sugar. I'm not going to eat any of the foods that I was eating previously. I'm going to switch to a complete whole food diet, which I think is phenomenal if it's relatively easy for you to do that. And I think, sure, there are people who I can push them and encourage them to make better food selections within their diet. But again, to what extent is this helping you relative to what is the likelihood that you're going to be able to follow this long term? Like the whole concept of like, okay, this is strictly for people who don't have like intolerances or sensitivities, people who are like, okay, should I eliminate dairy? Should I cut out all processed foods? It's like, yes, if like that's something that you want to do, if that's something that like generally makes you feel better, okay. But if you're coming to me and you're like, hey, I don't have any kind of structure or rigidity or decision making, like I don't have a framework in how I select the foods I'm going to eat. Like I want to eat better. I want to eat in a way that supports the goals I have from a composition standpoint, but I don't even know where to start, because it seems like every time I start a diet, it leads me into this overcompensation, because I'll restrict and then I'll binge, or I'll restrict and then I'll just, as soon as I'm done with the diet, I'll go back to how I was eating previously. It's not really helpful. And that's like kind of where I sit with, I mean, different fad diets, like keto, carnivore diet. It's like, sure, if that works for you and you're okay with how that impacts performance, but those types of diets, I mean, like they require a high degree of rigidity that for most people, they're not going to be able to follow that or stick to that kind of meal protocol, meal composition without understanding that there are going to be deviations semi-frequently. Like, sure, it might help you get the weight off initially. And I'm a fan if like, I mean, same thing with like fasting. If you're someone who's, you know, you're always snacking and you're just like, hey, I need to have structure. Okay, then let's have structure. But we don't need to go so far in the other direction that you are fasting to a point where the only thing that you're able to wrap your mind around from, I guess, like a impulse control standpoint is having this like super large meal at the end of the day that ultimately is more calories than you would have eaten if you had just had 3 well-designed, well-structured meals during the day. And the same logic kind of applies to going without cheat meals, which, sure, this might seem like I'm contradicting myself, but like personally, I can do really well without cheat meals. I can not eat out and I can track everything that I'm eating. There have been periods of my life where that has not been the case. There have been periods where I have eaten out more than maybe I would like to, but it's just the way that my schedule is set up. It's just the circumstances that I'm in. And because of that, I kind of have to go into that fat loss phase being like, these meals are going to be a part of how I eat, whether I want them to or not. So rather than set myself up for, okay, I'm on this plan that, you know, the line around like what is adherent and what is not eating out or not having an untracked meal, I won't be able to stick to that. And if that's the case, like if you're someone who does go out to eat pretty frequently or just not because you're forced to, but just because you enjoy it, okay, well maybe for you, maybe right now, maybe the point of life you're in is going to require that built into your program. These meals are just something that is accepted as this is just the best that you can do. It doesn't mean that just because it would be more accurate for you to go without these meals, well, yeah, like, I mean, from a food reporting standpoint, it would be more accurate if you could make everything that you consume and you could track everything perfectly to a T. But if it's not feasible, then don't go into that diet with that expectation. Again, you're setting yourself up to be in a position where now there's the perception that you failed your diet, which I think long term, I think there's a strong correlation with being non-adherent and not seeing those results that you're hoping for. And I say that really loosely, but I just mean like if you consistently are having failures, I mean, eventually, like you're going to get to the point where you're like, this sucks. Like, this isn't working for me. I started this because I was, aiming for a better outcome, but I'm not able to stick to it. Like generally the approach I like to take is looking at where someone's at, figuring out, I guess, determining how far I can push them away from what they're currently doing, depending on what it is, or depending on like what really needs to be modified. How far can I challenge them without overbidding, without putting them in a position where they are just set up to fail again and again. Yes, like fat loss agents, they can help create that deficit. And I mean, like, I think they can be really helpful, specifically if someone is going to be like dieting for an extended period of time. And if there's a strict deadline in place, sure, like lean on the fat loss agents, but they themselves, they're not going to do nearly what you're going to get from just simply being on a regimented diet that is truly a deficit for you. Having a degree of output that is creating that deficit, sure, they're going to offer some buffer, but like if you don't have a grasp on your input versus your output, like literally calories in, calories out, fat loss agents, they're not going to be effective because by definition, you're not in a deficit. They're only going to facilitate the process if it's already happening. They're not going to create the deficit for you. Expectation 6, I think we're at 6, maybe we're not. Training. Will strength go up? Will strength go down? Is this something that we should just blanketly assume? Not necessarily. I mean, it really depends on your training history. I've had people who've come to me who are like, by definition, they are untrained. They have very little time spent in the gym lifting correctly. And yeah, they're continuing to see progress in their lifts, in their performance, despite being in a fat loss phase. Amazing. I think the more advanced you get, and specifically if you have someone who is very dialed in with their training and their training volume is appropriate, if you have someone who's getting ready for stage, I mean, it's not to say we should just go in with this idea that training performance will go down, because I think that's oftentimes a cop-out. I think it lends people to inadvertently use less weight, try less globally in their training, not put forth the same intensity, and kind of fall back on the excuse of like, well, I'm in a deficit. What do you expect? It's like, yeah, but really what we should be aiming for is minimally like the preservation of that performance. Yeah, as weight goes down, you might not be as strong from a qualitative standpoint. Like there could be a decrease, especially if you're getting like ready for stage, especially if we're talking about like highly systemically fatiguing movements. Yeah, you might lose some weight on the bar, but the goal should always be like, let's try to preserve as much of that performance as we can. And when you think, okay, like if you lose 10 pounds over the course of like 2-3 months, that's a significant amount of weight. And if you hold on to your training performance, if you do your best to not let it slip, well, I mean, that is a body weight. Those are all like the whole way as weight's going down. Those are all PRs relative to your body weight, your body fat. I think there's this idea specifically around training performance that once you get into a fat loss phase, you need to shy away from focusing on the weight lifted and focus more on the mind muscle connection. And sure, like I get the argument. I get that there are people that are going to be at a higher risk for injury depending on how lean they are and depending on the types of movements. But what I really want to stress and what I think people should avoid generally is like being cornered into this idea that just because I'm not eating enough to support my performance, that in itself is an excuse to not look at performance, to not look at the weight that's being lifted, to not do the same amount of volume, which is another big one I get is like, well, because I can't lift as much, should I increase volume? Should I go from 3 sets to 4 sets? It's a good way if you do that blindly to bury yourself in training volume. And sure, like maybe there's a justification to begin to modify different modalities as you become leaner, as recovery begins to take a hit. Maybe you're carrying a lot more fatigue just at a baseline. So it might make sense to move away from a movement that's going to require more bracing as opposed to one that, you know, let's say with the machine, like it's going to keep you relatively in the right position. There's going to be much less of a stability requirement in some movements as opposed to others. And that's where I think it's really important to have continuity in training so that when you get to the point where fatigue is rearing its head, you can make that decision like, hey, let's switch to a modality that is less fatiguing. But simply going in and just saying, okay, well, I'm going to chase the pump and I'm going to lift less because I'm in a deficit or because weights started to go down. I think a lot of people do this and, you know, maybe it's perpetuated like across social media, but I think for the most part, it's a cop out. I think a lot of people can do more in their training, yet the idea that they're in a diet has now become this scapegoat for them to really just not try as hard when they're in the gym. I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. I hope this was helpful. If there was anything I missed, if there was anything that I didn't touch on fully, please let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you guys for watching. I will see you in the next one.